Chapter 1. A Boy in Scotland. Andrew Carnegie was born in a small, humble house in Dunfermline, Scotland. The year was 1835, and life in the town was far from easy. The streets were narrow and filled with people who, like Andrew's family, worked hard just to survive. Dunfermline was a place of tradition, where weaving had been passed down from father to son. And Andrew's father, William Carnegie, was a weaver. His loom stood in their small, cramped home, clattering day and night. But the world was changing. Fast. And so was their life. New machines were being built, machines that could weave faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than any man could. William Carnegie watched as his once respected trade began to disappear. The orders slowed down, the pay became less, and soon, even working all day couldn't keep the family afloat. They were sinking into poverty. Andrew saw it all. He was just a boy, but he understood the worry in his father's eyes, the quiet tears of his mother, Margaret. Margaret Carnegie was the heart of the family, strong, determined, and proud. She did everything she could to keep them together, to keep hope alive. "We'll find a way," she would whisper to Andrew at night, but even she knew that hope was slipping away, little by little. Andrew could hear the tension in her voice, feel the weight of her words. There wasn't much light in the Carnegie home, no electricity back then, of course. At night, the family would sit by the dim glow of a single candle, trying to stretch out the last of the evening warmth before the cold Scottish night crept in. Andrew would listen to the sound of his father's loom slowing down, the thread snapping, as if even the loom had given up. But Andrew, young Andrew, had a fire inside him, a hunger. He didn't want to be trapped by the life his father had. As he sat there listening to the loom stop for the last time each day, he would dream. He'd dream of a life far beyond Dunfermline, a life where he wasn't poor, a life where his family didn't have to struggle for every penny. "There must be more," he'd say to himself. "There has to be more." One day, the world around him changed forever. It was a cold morning, the sky gray and unforgiving, when his father came home with the news. "It's over," William Carnegie said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no more work. The machines, they've taken it all." The silence that followed was unbearable. His father had always been strong, always kept going, but now he looked defeated. Andrew's heart ached as he watched his father lower his head in shame. His mother, standing tall as ever, didn't cry. She simply looked at her husband and said, "Then we must leave. There's nothing for us here." And just like that, the decision was made. The Carnegies would leave Scotland. They would sail to America, the land of opportunity, the place where they hoped Andrew's father could find work, where Andrew could find a future. But for Andrew, this wasn't just about survival. This was about something more. This was about proving that he could rise above his circumstances, that he could be something greater than the loom, something greater than poverty. The journey to America wasn't easy. They had to sell everything they owned just to buy the tickets. The few possessions they had left were packed into old, worn-out bags, and soon the Carnegie family found themselves boarding a ship. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, and the ship groaned as it prepared to sail. Andrew looked back at Scotland one last time. Dunfermline, the only home he had ever known, growing smaller and smaller in the distance, but he didn't feel sad. No. Andrew felt something else. Excitement. He was leaving behind the world of his father, the world of the past. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was sure, absolutely sure, that it had to be better than what they were leaving behind. "America," he whispered under his breath. "I'll make my fortune there." The sea voyage was long and difficult. The ship rocked violently during storms, and the passengers, crowded together in the lower decks, often felt sick and weak. Andrew watched as his father grew more tired with each passing day, the weight of his failure in Scotland heavy on his shoulders. But Margaret never lost her strength. She kept the family going, even when the food ran low, even when the future seemed uncertain. And Andrew, he kept dreaming. Every wave that crashed against the ship, every gust of wind only fueled his determination. This is the start, he thought. This is where my life really begins. After weeks at sea, they finally arrived. America, the land of promise stretched out before them. The tall buildings of New York City loomed in the distance, and the air felt different, alive with opportunity, buzzing with energy. But the Carnegie family didn't stay in New York. They traveled west to Pittsburgh, the smoky city. Pittsburgh was unlike anything Andrew had ever seen. It was crowded, dirty, and noisy, with factories billowing smoke into the sky. This was the heart of industrial America, where fortunes could be made, but only if you were willing to work for it, and work they did. William Carnegie found a job in a cotton factory, but it paid little, and the conditions were harsh. Margaret took in sewing to help make ends meet, and Andrew, at just 13 years old, began his first job as a bobbin boy in a factory. The work was grueling. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The factory was loud, hot, and dangerous. But Andrew didn't complain. He worked hard. He watched. He listened. And above all, he learned. This wasn't the life he had imagined. Not yet. But he was in America now. And that spark of ambition inside him, that desire for something more, it was burning brighter than ever. As Andrew Carnegie would later say, the ladder of success is best climbed by stepping on the rungs of opportunity. And he was ready to start climbing. Chapter 2. The Journey to America. The year was 1848, and the Carnegies were leaving Scotland behind. The land they had known all their lives, the narrow streets of Dunfermline, the familiar faces, everything was fading into the distance as the ship sailed across the Atlantic. Andrew, just 13 years old, stood on the deck, watching the waves crash against the ship. The salty wind whipped at his face. America was waiting on the other side. But no one really knew what to expect. The voyage was long, cold, and hard. Hundreds of people crowded the ship, huddling together for warmth in the lower decks. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, sea salt, and the faint odor of sickness that lingered in the air. Andrew's mother, Margaret, stayed strong, comforting him and his brother Tom as the ship rocked back and forth, day after day. His father, William, remained silent, staring out into the endless horizon. His mind was heavy with thoughts of what lay ahead and what they had left behind. The days blurred together, filled with the sound of creaking wood, crashing waves, and the distant call of seagulls. Andrew tried to imagine what America would be like. He had heard stories of streets paved with gold, of endless opportunities. But as each cold night passed, he began to wonder. Was it all just a dream? Would America really be different? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship docked. The sound of the anchor dropping echoed through the air, and Andrew's heart raced. This was it, America. The family disembarked, joining the masses of people streaming onto the shore. New York City loomed in the distance, tall buildings rising up, smoke billowing from factories. The city was alive with noise, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the shouts of vendors, the hustle and bustle of thousands of people moving at once. But the Carnegies didn't stay. Their journey wasn't over yet. They took a train west, through forests and fields until they arrived in Pittsburgh, the smoky city. As they stepped off the train, Andrew looked around in awe. The air was thick with soot. the sky darkened by the constant smoke pouring from the factories that lined the riverbanks. The streets were crowded with workers, men, women, even children, covered in grime, their faces tired and worn. This was the reality of industrial America. This was their new home. Life in Pittsburgh wasn't easy. The winters were cold, bitterly cold, and the family had little to keep them warm. William Carnegie found work in a cotton factory, but the pay was barely enough to survive. Margaret took in laundry and sewing, working late into the night by candlelight to bring in a few extra pennies. And Andrew was eager to help. He didn't want to be a burden. He wanted to prove himself, to show that he could rise above the life they were living. At just 13 years old, Andrew took his first job as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory. The factory was a dark, noisy place, filled with the constant hum of machinery. The air smelled of oil and cotton dust. The machines roared as they spun the cotton into thread, and Andrew's job was to replace the empty bobbins with full ones, working as quickly as possible to keep the machines running. It was hard, exhausting work. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The noise was deafening, the machines clanging and thumping without rest. Andrew's hands were small, but they had to move fast. If the machine stopped, even for a moment, it meant lost time and lost money. The factory floor was crowded with other boys like him, all working, all tired. The older men supervising them barked orders, keeping them moving at all costs. But Andrew never complained. He worked hard. He wanted to prove that he could handle it, that he was strong. The pay? A mere $1.20 a week. It wasn't much, but it was something. He would come home each night, hands sore, feet aching, but with a few coins in his pocket. He handed his earnings to his mother, who smiled and thanked him. But Andrew could see the worry in her eyes. This wasn't the life they had imagined. America, the land of opportunity, felt more like a land of struggle. Yet, even in the darkest moments, Andrew kept his dreams alive. Every day he worked, he was learning, watching, thinking. He paid attention to everything around him. The factory, the machines, the workers, he studied it all. He knew that this wasn't where he was meant to stay. No, he wanted more. He started borrowing books. The local mechanic, Mr. Anderson, had a small library that he allowed workers to use for free. Andrew would spend every spare moment reading. History, science, economics. He devoured any book he could get his hands on. His mind raced with ideas. He wanted to understand how the world worked, how business worked, how people like him could rise above the dirt and smoke of the factories. But the road ahead wasn't clear. Pittsburgh was a tough city. The steel mills dominated the landscape, and the people working in them struggled just to survive. Andrew saw it every day. The long hours, the dangerous conditions, the endless cycle of poverty. And he knew that if he was going to escape that life, he would have to fight for it. As the years passed, Andrew continued to work in the factory. But with every step he took, he moved closer to his goal. He saved his money, studied the world around him, and looked for opportunities, any opportunity to get ahead. He wasn't content to remain a bobbin boy forever. He had seen what life was like at the bottom, and he was determined to climb his way to the top. One cold winter's day, as he walked home from the factory, Andrew stopped in the middle of the street. The wind howled, snow falling lightly from the sky. He looked up at the smoke-filled sky, his breath visible in the freezing air. "I will make it," he whispered to himself. "I will make something of myself." And in that moment, something shifted inside him. He wasn't just a boy from Scotland anymore. He was Andrew Carnegie, a boy with a dream, a boy with a plan. America hadn't broken him. It had only made him stronger. Chapter 3. The Telegraph Office. At just 16, Andrew Carnegie's life was about to change again. After years of working in the cotton factory, his days filled with the deafening roar of machines and his nights spent dreaming of something better, an opportunity finally came. It wasn't a job in the mills nor in the railroads, but in something new. Something that could connect him to the world in ways he had never imagined. The telegraph. It started with a simple thought. I need to get closer to the action, closer to the men who make decisions, Andrew whispered to himself one evening. And as if by fate, he heard of a position opening at a local telegraph office. It was a small job, at first, just running messages back and forth. But Andrew knew it was more than that. He knew this was his chance. The telegraph was the newest invention, connecting cities, businesses, and people across distances like never before. Messages that once took days or weeks to deliver could now be sent in minutes. And Andrew? He was going to be a part of it. The moment he walked into that telegraph office, his world began to expand. The work was fast-paced and challenging, but Andrew thrived. His mind worked like the telegraph machines, quick and sharp. He learned the telegraph code in no time, mastering the clicks and taps that formed each letter and word. He was the youngest boy in the office, but no one could match his determination. He stayed late, came in early, and never wasted a moment. Soon, he wasn't just delivering messages, he was sending them. Sitting at the telegraph machine, Andrew tapped out orders, news, and important information, his fingers flying over the keys. It felt powerful. He was the one transmitting the words that would shape business deals, political decisions, and even lives. And with each message he sent, he gained a little more confidence. It didn't take long for his hard work to get noticed. One day, the manager of the office, Mr. Brooks, called him over. "Carnegie," he said, "you're a quick learner. I've seen how you handle things around here. Keep it up, and you might just go places." Those words echoed in Andrew's mind. You might just go places. That's exactly what he intended to do. But it wasn't just about doing his job well. Andrew knew that to succeed, he needed more than just skill. He needed connections. Every day, important businessmen and railroad men passed through the telegraph office, sending and receiving messages. Andrew made sure to greet each of them with a smile, to remember their names, and to always offer his help. He listened carefully to their conversations, absorbing every bit of knowledge he could. He was learning the language of business, and, with each passing day, his ambition grew. One of the most important figures who came into the office was a man named Thomas Scott. Scott was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most powerful men in the industry. Andrew watched him closely. He could see that Scott was a man of action, a man who made things happen, and Andrew wanted to be just like him. It wasn't long before Scott noticed the eager young telegraph operator. Andrew's efficiency and enthusiasm stood out, and soon Scott began trusting him with more important tasks. He asked Andrew to stay late to handle private messages or run important documents to key figures in the city. Andrew never said no. He was always ready, always willing to go the extra mile. And then, one day, the opportunity Andrew had been waiting for arrived. Scott offered him a position as his personal assistant. It was a huge leap, from telegraph operator to working directly under one of the most powerful men in the railroad business. Andrew couldn't believe his ears. His heart raced as he accepted the offer, knowing that this was his chance to step into a whole new world. Working for Scott was intense. The railroad business was fast-moving and full of risks. But Andrew loved it. He soaked up everything Scott taught him about management, about decision-making, and about the importance of timing in business. He learned how to negotiate deals, how to handle large sums of money, and how to think strategically. He was no longer just a boy running messages. He was becoming a businessman. However, the job came with challenges. The pressure was enormous. Every day was a test of Andrew's ability to stay calm under stress, to make quick decisions, and to prove himself. He often worked long hours, sometimes late into the night, as the railroad expanded across the country. The stakes were high, and mistakes could cost millions. But Andrew kept his focus, never letting the stress overwhelm him. With Scott's guidance, Andrew began investing his own small savings. He didn't have much, but he was smart. He put his money into the railroad, into companies he believed would grow. Slowly but surely, his investments paid off. He was no longer just earning a salary. He was building his own wealth. But while Andrew's star was rising, he couldn't ignore the struggles of those around him. The telegraph office, the factories, the railroad yards, everywhere he looked, he saw men and boys working long, grueling hours for little pay. His own family still lived modestly, and the hard days of his youth were never far from his mind. He knew what it felt like to be at the bottom, to have nothing. As he grew closer to the world of business, Andrew couldn't help but feel the tension between his ambition and the harsh realities of life for the working class. It was a difficult balance. He wanted success. He wanted to rise above his humble beginnings. But he also knew that the system that had given him his opportunities was the same system that kept others in poverty. Still, Andrew pressed on. He knew he had to take advantage of every opportunity if he was going to succeed, and succeed he did. With each passing year, he grew more confident, more skilled, and more connected. He was no longer just a young boy dreaming of a better life. He was a young man with a future. The telegraph office had opened the door. The railroad had given him the tools. And now, Andrew Carnegie was ready to take his next step into a world where power and wealth awaited him. Chapter 4. Riding the Rails of Success. Andrew Carnegie's big break came when he became the personal assistant to Thomas Scott, the powerful superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to leave behind the telegraph office and step into the world of real business. Carnegie was only 18 at the time, but he had already proven himself to be sharp, quick, and most importantly, ambitious. Working for Scott was no easy job. Every day brought new challenges, new decisions, and new pressures. The railroad was the backbone of America's economy, transporting goods and people across the country. Scott was at the center of it all, making deals, solving problems, and expanding the rail lines. Andrew watched him closely, learning everything he could. He learned how to negotiate, how to take risks, and how to think ahead. Scott was more than just a boss. He was a mentor. But with each lesson, Andrew also learned about the harsh realities of power. The railroad business was cutthroat. Companies fought for control of routes, battled over prices, and competed fiercely for contracts. Mistakes weren't just costly. They could destroy entire companies. And it wasn't just the companies that paid the price. It was the workers, too. Andrew quickly saw that the men working on the railroads were often pushed to their limits. The hours were long, the work was dangerous, and the pay was low. Accidents were common. Trains would derail, tracks would break, and sometimes workers would be injured, or worse. But Scott didn't have time to worry about that. His job was to keep the trains running, no matter the cost. As Andrew rose through the ranks, he began to see the cracks in the system. He couldn't ignore the way workers were treated, yet he knew that to succeed in this world, he had to be tough. He had to focus on the bigger picture, on profits, expansion, and growth. This is how the world works, he told himself. If I want to rise, I have to play the game. And rise he did. Under Scott's guidance, Andrew began to make smart investments. With the little savings he had, He bought shares in companies connected to the railroad, iron mills, bridges, and telegraph lines. He understood that the railroad wasn't just about trains. It was about everything that kept the trains moving. Iron for the tracks, coal for the engines, telegraphs to communicate across distances. Andrew's mind was constantly racing, seeing connections and opportunities where others didn't. His first major investment was in the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company, a business that manufactured special train cars designed for passengers to sleep in during long journeys. It was a risk, but Andrew believed in the future of long-distance travel. And he was right. The investment paid off handsomely, bringing in more money than Andrew had ever seen before. Success followed success, and soon Andrew was no longer just Scott's assistant. He was becoming a businessman in his own right, respected by the powerful men in the industry. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he had made enough money to start thinking about the future, not just surviving, but thriving. He was still young, but already his name carried weight. People started to take notice of the young man with the sharp mind. But with success came difficult choices. Andrew was gaining wealth, but he couldn't ignore the world around him. The railroad industry was booming, but it was built on the backs of workers who labored day and night for little pay. The conditions were harsh, and Andrew saw it every day. He saw the men laying the tracks in the blazing summer heat, working through freezing winters, and risking their lives with every shift. The railroad pushed forward, no matter the human cost. Andrew felt conflicted. On one hand, he admired men like Scott, who understood how to build an empire and make profits soar. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was this the only way to succeed? Did wealth have to come at such a high price? He thought of his own family, of the days when his father had lost everything as machines replaced skilled weavers. He remembered the struggle, the desperation, and now here he was, standing on the other side. He was becoming one of the powerful men who made the decisions that could affect the lives of thousands of workers. Still, Andrew kept climbing. He continued to work for Scott, learning more with each passing year. His responsibilities grew, and with them, his influence. He began making decisions that impacted the entire railroad system, negotiating contracts, securing new routes, and managing the complex web of businesses that kept the trains moving. Every deal, every partnership, every new line was a step closer to the top. But the higher he climbed, the more he realized just how ruthless the business world could be. It wasn't just about making money, it was about keeping power. Competitors would stop at nothing to gain control of the railroads, and Andrew saw firsthand how deals could be made in smoke-filled rooms, with secret agreements and backdoor negotiations. It was a world where only the strongest survived, and Andrew was determined to survive. As his fortune grew, so did his ambition. He was no longer content to simply work for Scott. He wanted to build something of his own, something bigger, something lasting. He began to think about the future, about what kind of empire he could create. He wasn't just a boy from Scotland anymore. He was Andrew Carnegie, a rising star in the railroad industry, and he had his eyes set on something far beyond the horizon. But with every success, the shadows of exploitation loomed larger. The workers who laid the tracks, who kept the trains running, who risked their lives every day, Andrew couldn't forget them. The more he gained, the more he wondered, was it all worth it? Could wealth be built without stepping on the backs of others? The questions lingered, but Andrew pushed them aside. For now, the path was clear. He was riding the rails of success, and nothing would stop him. Chapter 5. The Birth of Steel. Andrew Carnegie's journey took a sharp turn when he saw the future, and it was made of steel. The railroad industry was booming, and it was clear to Andrew that steel was the key to everything. Stronger than iron, more durable, and perfect for the expanding rail lines. Steel would be the material that shaped America's future. And Andrew? He wanted to be at the center of it all. He had already built a fortune through his work with the railroads, but he knew that steel was where the real power lay. He wasn't content to just be a successful businessman. He wanted to revolutionize industry itself. And so, in 1875, Andrew Carnegie built his first steel mill, the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, just outside of Pittsburgh. It would be the beginning of an empire. The mill was enormous, its tall smokestacks belching black smoke into the sky as molten steel poured from the furnaces. The noise was deafening. The hiss of steam, the clanging of machinery, the roar of the fire. Workers moved quickly through the heat, their bodies drenched in sweat, their faces hardened by the long hours. Carnegie stood at the top, watching it all unfold. This, he thought, is the future. Carnegie wasn't just building a business. He was building the backbone of America. Steel was needed for railroads, bridges, buildings, everything that would allow the country to grow. And Carnegie's steel was the best. He had invested in the latest technology, bringing over the Bessemer process from England, a method that allowed steel to be produced faster and cheaper than ever before. It was a game changer. The money started pouring in. With each new rail line built, with every bridge that crossed a river, Carnegie's fortune grew. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was an industrial titan. But success came at a cost, and that cost was paid by the men who worked in his mills. The steel mills were dangerous places. The heat was unbearable. The machines were massive, and accidents were all too common. Workers labored for long hours, sometimes 12 or even 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their pay was low, barely enough to support their families, and there was little room for mistakes. If a worker slowed down or couldn't keep up, there was always someone else ready to take his place. Carnegie knew all this. He saw it. But in his mind, this was just the way things were. Progress, he would say, comes at a price. And yet deep down, he couldn't ignore the growing tension. The workers in his mills were becoming restless. They saw the vast fortune Carnegie was building, and they knew it was their labor that made it possible. They demanded more, better pay, shorter hours, safer conditions. But Andrew had no time for demands. His focus was on expansion. He built more mills, invested in more railroads, and bought out competitors. His steel was used everywhere, from the tracks that carried trains across the country to the towering skyscrapers rising in New York City. He was building America, and he wasn't going to slow down for anyone. As his empire grew, so did the gap between him and his workers. To Carnegie, it was simple. He believed in efficiency, in making sure every part of his business ran smoothly and at the lowest possible cost. He introduced strict rules in the mills, pushing his workers to produce more steel in less time. The men on the factory floor, however, saw it differently. To them, it felt like they were being treated as machines, not men. The tension came to a head one hot summer day when a group of workers approached Carnegie's managers with their concerns. "The hours are too long. The work is too dangerous," they said. "We need better pay." But the answer from Carnegie's management was clear. No, the mills needed to stay profitable. And if that meant pushing the workers harder, then so be it. Carnegie, always looking for ways to keep costs down, even turned to Henry Clay Frick, a tough businessman known for his ruthless tactics. Frick was brought in to help manage the mills, and his approach was simple: squeeze every last drop of profit from the workers. He cut costs wherever he could, driving the men harder and harder. The mills became even more grueling, the hours even longer. For Carnegie, The results were clear. His steel mills were the most efficient in the world. He was producing more steel than anyone, and the profits were soaring. But for the workers, life became a daily grind of exhaustion and fear. Accidents were common. Injuries were expected. And yet Carnegie kept building, kept expanding, kept growing richer. But even as his empire grew, so did the rumblings of discontent. The workers knew they couldn't keep going like this forever. They had families to feed, lives to live. They wanted more, and they weren't alone. Across the country, workers in factories, mills, and mines were beginning to rise up, demanding better treatment. Labor strikes were becoming more common, and tensions between the rich industrialists and the working class were reaching a breaking point. Carnegie, for all his wealth and success, found himself at a crossroads. He had built an empire on the backs of his workers. He had pushed them harder than anyone, driven them to produce more, to work longer, to make him richer. But now those same workers were starting to push back. The shadow of exploitation was growing darker. For Andrew, the question was simple. Would he listen, or would he continue to push forward, no matter the cost? For now, the answer seemed clear. Carnegie was determined to build something bigger than himself. He wasn't just thinking about the present, he was thinking about his legacy. He wanted to be remembered as the man who built America, the man who turned steel into the foundation of the modern world. But the men in the mills, they wanted something too. And soon, Carnegie would have to face the consequences of his choices. Chapter 6. Fortunes and Failures. Andrew Carnegie's fortune grew with every deal he made, but not everything went as planned. For every successful venture, there were risks, some that paid off and some that failed miserably. Yet no matter what, Carnegie always found a way to bounce back. It was as if failure only fueled his ambition, pushing him to work harder, to think smarter, and to chase his dream of being remembered as something more than just a rich man. In the late 1800s, Carnegie was riding high. His steel mills were producing more steel than ever, his wealth was multiplying, and his name was becoming synonymous with success. He was one of the richest men in the world. But as he expanded his empire, he didn't always make the right choices. Not every investment turned to gold. Some, in fact, collapsed under the weight of bad luck, bad timing, or simply bad decisions. One of his biggest challenges came when he invested in the oil industry. At the time, oil was becoming a valuable resource, and Carnegie, always eager to capitalize on new opportunities, dove in headfirst. He bought large amounts of land, believing it would bring him even more wealth. But the oil market was unpredictable, and instead of profits, Carnegie faced heavy losses. Wells dried up, and oil prices dropped. What had seemed like a sure thing quickly turned into a disaster. But Carnegie didn't panic. He never did. Instead, he viewed every failure as a lesson, a chance to learn and do better next time. "You can't win them all," he'd say, brushing off his losses and moving on to the next opportunity. He believed that success wasn't about never failing. It was about never giving up. He also invested in several ventures that didn't quite live up to their promises. Real estate deals, mining operations, and various industries outside of steel. They all had potential, but they weren't always profitable. Carnegie, however, refused to let these failures define him. He was a man with a vision, and that vision extended far beyond his wealth. Even as he lost money in some investments, his steel business continued to thrive. The railroads kept expanding, and steel was in high demand. His mills, powered by the latest technologies, produced steel faster and cheaper than his competitors. It was this relentless innovation that kept him ahead of the game. But Carnegie's hunger wasn't just for money. It was for something more lasting. He wanted to leave a mark on the world. He wanted to be remembered. "You know," he once told a friend, "a man who dies rich dies disgraced." It was a strange thing to hear from one of the richest men alive, but Carnegie meant every word. He didn't want to be known just for his fortune. He wanted to be remembered for how he used it. It was during this time that Andrew began thinking seriously about his legacy. He had made more money than he ever dreamed possible, but now his mind started to turn toward a bigger question: what will I leave behind? He didn't just want to be a successful businessman. He wanted to be a force for good. He wanted people to look back and see that he had done more than build steel mills. He wanted to shape the future. This wasn't to say that Carnegie suddenly became a saint. No, he was still very much driven by the pursuit of success. He still negotiated tough deals, still cut costs where he could, still pushed his workers to their limits. But there was a shift, a growing desire to balance his wealth with giving back. He started talking about philanthropy, about the responsibility of the wealthy to help those less fortunate. And while he didn't yet act on these ideas fully, the seeds were planted. But even as his vision for his legacy evolved, Carnegie remained a shrewd businessman. He wasn't done taking risks. In fact, some of his greatest successes came from his willingness to push the boundaries, to try new things even when they seemed risky. One such risk was his decision to invest heavily in vertical integration, a strategy where Carnegie controlled every part of the steelmaking process. From the raw materials like iron ore and coal to the transportation, production, and distribution, Carnegie owned it all. This gave him immense power. He could set prices, reduce costs, and dominate the industry. It was a bold move, and it paid off. His steel empire grew even larger, and with it, his wealth. But as his fortune swelled, so did the problems beneath the surface. The workers in his mills continued to struggle, and strikes became more frequent. The more Carnegie pushed for efficiency, the harder life became for those on the factory floor. The tension was building, and Andrew knew it. He was walking a fine line between building his legacy and exploiting the people who made his wealth possible. Still, Carnegie kept his focus on the future. He began to pour more time and energy into his philanthropic ideas. He gave to universities, funded libraries, and supported education. In his mind, knowledge was the key to a better world, and he wanted to make it accessible to everyone. But as generous as these acts were, there was always a question lurking in the background. Was this enough? Could his charitable donations ever balance the scales, considering the conditions in his mills? For Carnegie, the answer wasn't clear. He was a man of contradictions, driven by ambition, but also by a desire to give back. He made his fortune by pushing people to their limits, but he also believed in helping those less fortunate. As he rose to greater heights, these contradictions became harder to ignore. His fortune was vast, but so were the challenges that came with it. In the end, Carnegie's story wasn't just one of success or failure. It was both. He took risks and some paid off while others didn't. He built an empire, but it came at a cost. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that his legacy would be judged not just by the wealth he created, but by how he used it. Andrew Carnegie had learned one important lesson. Success wasn't just about making money. It was about what you did with it. And that, more than anything, would define how he would be remembered. Chapter 7. The Workers' Struggle. Not everyone saw Andrew Carnegie as a hero. To the world, he was the great steel king, the man who built an empire. But to the workers in his mills, the picture was much darker. The men who labored in his steel factories worked long, exhausting hours. The heat was unbearable, the noise deafening, and danger lurked around every corner. For all their hard work, they earned little pay, just enough to survive, but never enough to get ahead. Carnegie's steel mills never stopped. Day and night the furnaces roared, turning raw iron into the steel that would build America. But for the men who toiled in these mills, life was a grind. 12 hours a day, sometimes more. 6 days a week. The conditions were harsh. Accidents were common. Fingers lost to machines. Burns from molten steel. Sometimes men didn't make it out alive. The workers were tired. They were angry. And they wanted change. In the summer of 1892, tensions finally boiled over. It all happened at the Homestead Steel Works, one of Carnegie's largest mills located near Pittsburgh. The workers, fed up with low pay and brutal conditions, demanded better wages. They had formed a union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and they were ready to stand up for their rights. They wanted fair treatment. They wanted a voice. But Andrew Carnegie wasn't there to listen. Carnegie had left for Scotland, retreating to his luxurious estate thousands of miles away. He didn't want to deal with the labor troubles back home. Instead, he left the task to his business partner, Henry Clay Frick. Frick was a tough, ruthless man, known for his no-nonsense approach. He had little patience for unions, and even less sympathy for the workers' demands. When the union approached management with their requests, Frick's answer was simple. No. There would be no higher wages, no better conditions. Instead, Frick made a plan to break the union by any means necessary. The workers at Homestead were left with no choice. They went on strike, shutting down the mill. Thousands of men refused to work until their demands were met. The factory gates were locked, and the men gathered outside, holding signs, chanting for justice. It seemed, for a moment, like they might have a chance to win. But Frick wasn't about to back down. While Carnegie remained in Scotland, writing letters of support but staying far away from the conflict, Frick took matters into his own hands. He hired private security guards, the Pinkertons, armed men brought in to break the strike and force the workers back to their jobs. On the morning of July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons arrived. They came by boat, floating silently down the Monongahela River toward the factory. As the boats neared the shore, the workers spotted them. Shouts rang out. Tension crackled in the air. The workers knew what was coming, and they were ready to fight. The Pinkertons tried to land, but the strikers blocked their way. Rocks flew through the air, tempers flared, then suddenly, shots rang out. No one knows who fired first, but in an instant chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the mill yard as both sides clashed in a bloody battle. Men fell, wounded or dead, their bodies strewn across the ground. The air was thick with smoke and fear. The fighting raged for hours. The workers, determined to protect their rights, fought bravely, but the Pinkertons were relentless. Eventually, they were forced to retreat, but the damage was done. Blood had been spilled, and the country watched in shock as news of the violence spread. The Homestead strike had turned into a battle that left 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons dead, with many more injured. And though the workers had won that day, driving the Pinkertons away, the victory was short-lived. The state militia was called in soon after, and with overwhelming force, they crushed the strike. The mill reopened, and the workers were left defeated, their union broken. Andrew Carnegie, still in Scotland, stayed silent through it all. For many, this was the moment when Carnegie's reputation began to crack. Up until then, he had been seen as a man of vision, a leader of industry who brought progress to America. But the Homestead strike revealed a darker side to his empire. While Carnegie spoke of philanthropy and the responsibilities of the wealthy, his workers were paying the price for his success. The public began to question, could a man who allowed such violence in his name truly be called a hero? Carnegie himself struggled with the aftermath. Letters from Scotland show that he was troubled by the bloodshed, by the violence that had unfolded in his absence. But at the same time, he stood by Frick's decisions. He believed that the strike had to be broken, that the steel business couldn't survive if the workers were allowed to take control. In his mind, progress came with a cost, and that cost, unfortunately, was paid by those at the bottom. The Homestead strike left deep scars. The workers who had fought so bravely were left with nothing. They were blacklisted, unable to find work in the industry again. The union was shattered, its power broken. And the mill, it kept running. The steel kept flowing, and Carnegie's fortune kept growing. But the world had changed. The Homestead strike was more than just a labor dispute. It was a symbol of the growing divide between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the powerless. For Carnegie, it was a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. No matter how much he gave to charity, no matter how many libraries he built or scholarships he funded, the shadow of Homestead would always linger. Andrew Carnegie had built an empire, but it was an empire built on the backs of workers who had little and gave much. The bloodshed at Homestead was a reminder that wealth, power, and progress often come with a price that isn't always paid by those at the top. And while the world would go on to remember Andrew Carnegie as a philanthropist, a man who gave away millions to help others, the workers who toiled in his mills, and the men who died at Homestead would remember him very differently. Chapter 8. Building Libraries, Buying Peace. By the late 1890s, Andrew Carnegie had reached the peak of his wealth and power. His steel empire was vast, his fortune unimaginable, but something inside him had begun to change. He had made his money, more than he could ever spend in a lifetime, and now he wanted to give back. He wanted to be remembered for something more than steel and strikes. He wanted to shape a legacy that would live on long after he was gone. For Andrew, the answer lay in libraries. From his earliest days, knowledge had been his key to success. He had risen from poverty through hard work, yes, but also through learning. As a young boy, he had borrowed books from a local benefactor's library, books that opened up new worlds and possibilities. Now he wanted to give that same chance to others. Libraries, he once said, are the best tools for lifting people up. Knowledge is power. And so he began to donate. And he didn't stop. Carnegie's passion for libraries knew no bounds. From small towns to large cities, from America to Scotland, he funded the construction of more than 2,500 libraries worldwide. He poured millions of dollars into these projects, believing that access to books and education would help people rise, just as he had. For Andrew, libraries were a gift to the future. They were a way for the poor, the working class, and anyone with ambition to learn, grow, and change their lives. Carnegie believed that the wealthy had a responsibility to give back to society. He called it the gospel of wealth. In his view, the rich shouldn't die with their fortunes. They should use their money to help others. And for Carnegie, libraries were the perfect way to fulfill that duty. The world took notice. He was hailed as a great philanthropist, a man who had used his immense fortune not for selfish reasons, but for the public good. Cities across America and beyond celebrated when they received word that Carnegie had offered to fund a library. His name became associated with education, progress, and opportunity. Everywhere you turned, it seemed there was a Carnegie library, a symbol of his generosity. But even as the praise flowed in, there were questions, whispers that couldn't be ignored. Could these generous acts of philanthropy really erase the darker side of his empire? Could the libraries, the scholarships, the donations truly cover the harsh reality of how his fortune was made? For while Andrew was building libraries, many still remembered the conditions in his steel mills. They remembered the long hours, the dangerous work, the men who had died at Homestead. They remembered the strikes, the struggles, and the way workers had been treated. For the laborers, the memory of those hardships could not be washed away by bricks and books. Andrew Carnegie knew this. He was a man of contradictions, deeply proud of his philanthropy, yet unable to fully shake the guilt of how he had earned his fortune. His steel empire had been built on the backs of men who worked in brutal conditions, men who had risked their lives to make him rich. And while he now sought to give back to society, to help others rise through knowledge and education, he couldn't escape the shadow of his past. But Carnegie pressed on. He believed in his mission, and he continued to fund libraries, universities, and cultural institutions. He gave millions to education, the arts, and scientific research. He saw himself as a man of vision, someone who could transform the world for the better through his wealth. One of his proudest moments came when he established the Carnegie Corporation of New York, a foundation dedicated to funding education and research. He wanted to ensure that even after he was gone, his money would continue to work for the public good. It wasn't just about libraries anymore. It was about leaving a legacy that would last for generations. But again, the question lingered. Could his philanthropy truly erase the pain of the past? For many, the answer was complicated. To some, Carnegie was a hero. He had given away vast sums of money, built schools, and funded countless libraries, all with the goal of helping others. His actions inspired other wealthy individuals to follow in his footsteps, to give back to society rather than hoarding their wealth. He was seen as a visionary, a man who used his power and fortune to change the world. Yet to others, especially the men who had worked in his mills, Carnegie's libraries were seen as hollow gifts. The books couldn't heal the scars left by years of exploitation. The beautiful buildings couldn't erase the memory of the workers' struggles. For these men and their families, the libraries were a reminder of the divide between the rich and the poor, a divide that Carnegie's wealth had only made wider. Still, Carnegie believed in his mission. He saw libraries as a symbol of hope, of progress. He imagined young boys, much like he had been, walking into a library, picking up a book, and starting their journey toward a better life. He imagined a future where knowledge was free, where anyone, regardless of their background, could rise through learning. It was a beautiful dream, but it existed side by side with the darker realities of his past. In the end, Andrew Carnegie's legacy would be a complicated one. He was a man who had built both steel mills and libraries, who had created wealth through hard work and innovation, but at a great human cost. His philanthropy was vast, his contributions to education undeniable. But so were the struggles of the men who had helped him build his empire. As he grew older, Carnegie became more and more focused on giving away his fortune. He wanted to die knowing that he had left the world a better place than he had found it. And in many ways, he did. But no matter how many libraries he built, no matter how much money he gave, the question would always remain. Could Andrew Carnegie ever truly buy peace? Chapter 9. A New Mission. Peace. As Andrew Carnegie grew older, his focus shifted. His steel empire had brought him immense wealth, and his libraries had earned him praise as a philanthropist. But now, something deeper was stirring inside him. His thoughts turned away from business and wealth, and toward a much grander vision. World peace. Carnegie believed that just as he had built his fortune through hard work, diplomacy, and vision, nations too could find a way to work together for a peaceful future. War, he often said, is the foulest blot on civilization. It seemed senseless to him. Why, in an age of progress, science, and industry, were nations still fighting. Surely, if people could sit down and talk, reason would prevail. In the early 1900s, Carnegie threw himself into this new mission. He donated millions of dollars to support peace movements around the world. He funded organizations that worked to resolve international disputes without violence, promoting diplomacy over war. One of his proudest achievements was the creation of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an institution dedicated to preventing war through dialogue and negotiation. His dream was simple: to create a world where conflicts could be settled with words, not weapons. He imagined a future where countries would come together to resolve their differences, where armies would no longer march, and where peace would reign. But Carnegie's new mission was not as easy as building steel mills or libraries. The world, as he soon realized, was far more complicated than even the toughest business deal. Nations, like men, were driven by pride, power, and sometimes greed. And peace? Peace was much harder to negotiate than steel. Carnegie's passion for peace was sincere. He met with world leaders, diplomats, and activists, urging them to work together to prevent future wars. He funded conferences and gatherings where thinkers, politicians, and scholars would discuss how to achieve lasting peace. He even built the Palace of Peace in The Hague, a symbol of his dream, a place where nations could come together to settle their disputes peacefully. But even as Carnegie worked tirelessly for peace, the world was heading in the opposite direction. By the early 20th century, tensions were rising across Europe. Nationalism was growing stronger, alliances were forming, and old rivalries were bubbling to the surface. It was a dangerous mix, and it seemed like war was on the horizon. Carnegie, ever the optimist, refused to give up. He believed that with enough effort, peace could still be achieved. He wrote letters to world leaders, urging them to avoid war. "We must find a way," he would say, "to prevent the horrors of conflict." But despite his best efforts, the storm clouds continued to gather. In 1914, everything changed. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo sparked the beginning of World War I, Carnegie's dream of a peaceful world came crashing down. The war spread quickly, pulling country after country into the conflict. The very nations Carnegie had hoped would work together for peace were now locked in a brutal struggle that would last for years and cost millions of lives. Carnegie was devastated. He had spent his later years working to prevent exactly this. He had believed, perhaps naively, that reason would prevail, that humanity had progressed beyond the need for war. But now, faced with the grim reality of global conflict, he realized that peace was much harder to achieve than he had ever imagined. He watched in disbelief as the world plunged into chaos. His letters to world leaders went unanswered, his peace organizations struggled to make a difference, and the Palace of Peace stood empty, a monument to a dream that seemed further away than ever. As the war raged on, Carnegie's health began to decline. He had dedicated his life to building, to creating, to making the world a better place. But now, in his old age, he was forced to confront the fact that some battles, like the battle for peace, could not be won with money or vision alone. Still, he refused to give up hope entirely. Even as the world burned around him, Carnegie continued to believe in the possibility of peace. He held on to the idea that one day, after the horrors of war had passed, nations would finally see the value in diplomacy and cooperation. "War will end," he once said, "when the people demand peace." But by the time World War I came to a close in 1918, Carnegie's health had deteriorated significantly. He had witnessed the worst conflict the world had ever seen, and it had broken his heart. The man who had built an empire, given away millions, and dedicated his later years to preventing war had seen his greatest dream fall apart. Carnegie passed away in 1919, just a year after the war ended. He didn't live to see the world rebuilt, nor did he see the international peace efforts that would follow in the years to come. But his legacy, though complicated, was not forgotten. His work toward peace, while overshadowed by the Great War, laid the foundation for future generations to continue the fight for diplomacy and international cooperation. In the end, Andrew Carnegie's mission for peace was a noble one. He believed that just as he had overcome poverty to build an empire, the world could overcome its divisions to build a future without war. But the challenges he faced in this new mission were far greater than he had anticipated. While his steel and his libraries would stand the test of time, his dream of a peaceful world would remain unfinished. A reminder that even the greatest men cannot control the course of history. Chapter 10. The Cost of Ambition. Andrew Carnegie had achieved what few ever would: immense wealth, influence, and respect. By the end of his life, he was celebrated as one of the richest men in the world, a titan of industry, and a philanthropist who had given away millions to causes that would benefit humanity for generations. But as Carnegie grew older, he began to reflect on the choices he had made. Choices that had built his empire but left a complicated legacy. The world saw him as a great man, a visionary who helped shape modern America with his steel. His libraries stood as monuments to his belief in education and progress. His donations to universities and charities earned him praise from leaders and scholars. Yet behind the grand gestures, behind the towering achievements, there was something darker. Whispers of the lives affected by his relentless pursuit of success never went away. Carnegie's steel empire was built on hard work, innovation, and a fierce ambition. But it was also built on the backs of men who worked long hours in dangerous conditions for little pay. His mills had made him rich beyond measure, but they had taken a toll on the men who labored in the heat and smoke, day in and day out. These men didn't enjoy the luxury of Carnegie's success. They didn't benefit from his millions. For them, life was a constant struggle. As Carnegie grew older, these thoughts weighed on him. He had once believed that the ends justified the means, that progress required sacrifice, and that his wealth would ultimately help the world. But now, in the quiet moments of his later years, he wondered, had it all been worth it? He remembered the strikes, the anger of the workers, the bloodshed at Homestead. Those events had haunted him for years, even as he worked to distance himself from the violence. Carnegie had left the dirty work to Henry Clay Frick, but the decisions had been made in his name. He could not escape that. The workers had demanded better pay, safer conditions, and a fair share of the wealth they helped create. Instead, they had been met with force, with Pinkerton agents and armed guards. For all the libraries he had built, for all the good he had done, could that ever truly balance the scales? Could philanthropy erase the suffering that had helped create his fortune? In his later years, Carnegie tried to find peace. He gave more and more of his wealth away, believing that it was his duty to use his money for the greater good. A man who dies rich, he famously said, dies disgraced. He didn't want to leave behind vast riches. He wanted to leave behind a legacy of helping others. But no matter how many millions he gave away, the shadow of his past lingered. For every person who praised him for his generosity, there were others who remembered the cost of his ambition. The workers who had built his steel mills, the men who had fought and died at Homestead, the families who struggled while Carnegie's wealth grew. These were the voices that never quite faded away. Carnegie had believed in progress, in building something greater than himself. He had believed that his wealth could lift up society, that his success could inspire others to dream big, to work hard, and to achieve greatness. but he had also been ruthless in his pursuit of that success. He had made decisions that hurt people, that crushed unions, that prioritized profits over people. It was this duality that defined Carnegie's life. On one side, the visionary industrialist and generous philanthropist. On the other, the man whose empire was built on exploitation and inequality. He had given much to the world, but the world had given much to him too, often at a high cost to others. As he neared the end of his life, Carnegie spent his days reflecting on these choices. He had seen the best and worst of what ambition could achieve. He had risen from poverty to become one of the richest men in the world. Yet his journey had left a trail of difficult questions behind. Could one man's success ever truly be separated from the suffering it caused? Could philanthropy, no matter how generous, ever erase the darker side of an empire built on steel and sweat? For Andrew Carnegie, the answers were never simple. In 1919, Carnegie passed away, leaving behind a legacy that the world would debate for years to come. His steel mills had transformed America. His libraries had opened doors for countless individuals. His donations to education, science, and the arts had left an indelible mark on society. But so had the lives of the men who labored in his factories, who fought for fair treatment, who gave everything so that Carnegie could build his empire. Carnegie's life was a testament to the power of ambition, but it was also a reminder of the cost that often comes with great success. He had achieved what few ever would, but in the end, he was forced to confront the moral complexities of his journey. The world would remember him, not just for his wealth or his philanthropy, but for the duality of his legacy, the triumphs and the tragedies, the brilliance and the burdens. Andrew Carnegie had shaped the world, but the world had also shaped him. And as he looked back on his life, one truth remained clear. Greatness comes at a cost. Chapter 11. The Final Years. Andrew Carnegie's last years were spent far from the noise and heat of the steel mills, away from the relentless rush of business that had once defined his life. He had left the world of industry behind, and now in his twilight years, he focused on what mattered most to him, giving away his fortune. He had promised himself that he would not die rich, and he was determined to fulfill that promise. From his quiet estate in Scotland, surrounded by green hills and peaceful gardens, Carnegie worked tirelessly to fund education, promote peace, and support the arts. Letters and requests flooded in from all over the world, universities seeking funding, peace organizations looking for support, artists hoping for patronage, and Carnegie gave millions. He built schools, libraries, research centers, and institutions of learning, always believing that knowledge was the key to a better future. Yet, even as he gave away his wealth, the world around him was changing in ways that troubled him deeply. The world Carnegie had helped build, modern, industrial, and full of promise, was now teetering on the edge of conflict. Tensions in Europe were growing stronger every day. Alliances were forming, old rivalries resurfacing, and war seemed inevitable. It was a reality that weighed heavily on Carnegie's heart. For years he had dreamed of peace. He had funded organizations dedicated to preventing war, believing that nations could resolve their differences through diplomacy. His Palace of Peace in The Hague stood as a monument to his belief that reason and dialogue could win out over violence. But now, with war looming, his dream of a peaceful world felt more distant than ever. Carnegie could see it clearly. The industrial age he had helped to shape was now driving nations toward conflict. The same technology that had built railroads, bridges, and factories was now being used to build weapons, machines of war that could destroy as easily as they had once created. It was a bitter irony, and one that Carnegie struggled to accept. The steel that had brought him wealth and success was now being used to arm armies. As Europe edged closer to World War I, Carnegie's hope for peace began to fade. His letters to world leaders, once filled with optimism and calls for negotiation, now carried a tone of desperation. "We must find a way to avoid war," he would write, pleading with those in power. But his words went unheard. The march toward conflict continued, unstoppable. By 1914, when the first shots of the Great War were fired, Carnegie was an old man. His health had begun to decline, and he watched helplessly as the world he had tried to shape fell into chaos. The newspapers brought reports of battles, of soldiers marching into trenches, of nations tearing each other apart. The dream of peace that had once seemed so close was now shattered. Carnegie's heart ached as he realized that the world was not ready for his vision. Yet, despite the turmoil around him, Carnegie did not stop giving. He continued to fund libraries, to support education, and to invest in scientific research. He believed that even in the darkest times, knowledge could still bring light. His gifts to universities and scholars were his way of planting seeds for the future. A future that, he hoped, would one day embrace the ideals of peace and progress that had guided him. But Carnegie's final years were marked by a deep sense of reflection. He had achieved so much, more than he had ever dreamed possible. He had risen from poverty to become one of the richest men in the world. He had built an empire of steel, reshaping America's landscape. He had given away millions funding libraries, schools, and organizations dedicated to bettering humanity. But now, as his life neared its end, he wondered, would his legacy endure? Carnegie had always been a man of ambition, but now he questioned the price of that ambition. The workers in his mills, the strikes, the harsh conditions they had faced. It was impossible to forget. No matter how many libraries he built or how much he gave away, the memories of those difficult years lingered. He had created an empire, but had it been built on the suffering of others? The world, too, seemed to be questioning the value of progress. The war that raged across Europe was a direct result of the industrialization that men like Carnegie had championed. The machines, the technology, the power. It had all led to this. For Carnegie, it was a sobering realization. He had believed that progress would bring peace, that industry would lead to a better world. But now, as nations clashed in bloody conflict, that belief felt fragile. Still, Carnegie clung to hope. He believed that even after the war, the world could rebuild, that the ideals of education, knowledge, and peace could prevail. His libraries, his scholarships, his endowments, they would continue, long after he was gone, to help future generations. Perhaps, one day, the world would understand what he had tried to achieve. In August of 1919, Andrew Carnegie passed away. He left behind a vast fortune, most of which had been given away to causes that he believed would improve the world. He left behind steel mills, libraries, and institutions of learning. But he also left behind a complicated legacy, one that the world would debate for decades to come. In his final years, Carnegie had tried to buy peace. He had tried to shape the world through his philanthropy, to make amends for the costs of his ambition. But the world, as he learned, was not so easily changed. His life was a testament to the power of wealth and vision, but also a reminder that even the greatest men cannot control the tides of history. As the world emerged from the devastation of war, Carnegie's libraries stood as quiet monuments to his belief in knowledge and progress. And though peace had eluded him in life, his legacy continued to inspire those who believed, as he had, that the future could be brighter if we only dared to dream. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie passed away in 1919, leaving behind a fortune, a foundation of libraries, and a complicated legacy. The world remembers him as both a titan of industry and a man of charity. His name is written into history books, associated with progress, steel, and philanthropy. But even now, over a century later, one question remains. Was it all worth it? Carnegie had built an empire, reshaping America with his steel. The railroads, the bridges, the skyscrapers, all of these were possible because of the innovations Carnegie brought to the industry. His steel empire fueled the rise of modern cities, and in many ways, he helped to build the foundation of the country's industrial strength. His business acumen was unmatched, and his ability to see opportunities where others saw risks made him one of the wealthiest men of his time. But his rise to power came with a cost. The men who labored in his mills worked in brutal conditions. Long hours, dangerous machinery, and meager pay were the reality for most steelworkers. And when they dared to demand better treatment, they were met with force. The Homestead Strike of 1892, a bloody conflict between workers and Carnegie's hired Pinkerton agents, left scars that could never truly heal. Carnegie, far away in Scotland at the time, distanced himself from the violence, but the world did not forget. So, how do we remember him? On one side, Andrew Carnegie was a man of vision, a leader who believed in progress. His libraries opened doors to knowledge for millions of people. He donated over $350 million in his lifetime, an enormous sum of money given to causes that he believed would uplift humanity. His philanthropy reached far and wide, funding universities, scientific research, and peace efforts. For many, Carnegie represents the ideal of the self-made man. Someone who rose from poverty, achieved great wealth, and then used that wealth to give back to society. He believed that knowledge was power. A library outranks any other one thing a community can do to benefit its people, he once said, and he acted on that belief. His libraries, built in towns and cities across the world, gave people a chance to learn, to grow, to improve their lives. It was Carnegie's way of leveling the playing field, of offering opportunities to those who, like him, had once been poor and eager to rise. But there is another side to Andrew Carnegie's legacy. For all his generosity, the human cost of his empire is impossible to ignore. The men who toiled in his factories often saw little of the wealth their labor created. The labor strikes, the protests, the bloodshed at Homestead, these events reveal the darker side of Carnegie's ambition. He believed in efficiency, in progress at any cost, and sometimes that cost was paid with human lives. In his later years, Carnegie seemed to struggle with this duality. His philanthropy, especially his funding of peace initiatives, suggests a man trying to reconcile the success he had built with the suffering it had caused. He wrote passionately about his belief in world peace, about the responsibility of the wealthy to give back, and about the moral obligation to use money for the greater good. And yet, the shadow of his steel empire never truly left him. Carnegie's life raises important moral questions that remain relevant today. Can great wealth ever be truly good when it is built on the backs of others? Can philanthropy balance out the injustices of industry? And perhaps most importantly, can a person be both a hero and a villain? Carnegie was certainly not the first businessman to exploit workers in the name of profit, and he was not the last. But he was one of the few who seemed to genuinely believe in using his fortune for good. His libraries, his donations to education, his support for scientific research, these are all lasting contributions that have undeniably improved the world. Thousands of people have benefited from his generosity. But the benefits of his philanthropy do not erase the pain and hardship experienced by those who made his wealth possible. In the end, Carnegie's legacy is a complicated one. He was a man of contradictions, an industrialist who championed peace, a ruthless businessman who gave away his fortune, a visionary who couldn't fully escape the consequences of his ambition. He had taken much from the world, but also gave much in return. Whether that balance is enough is a question each generation must decide for itself. As we look back on Carnegie's life, we see both the brilliance of his accomplishments and the shadows cast by the choices he made. His libraries still stand, symbols of his belief in education and progress. His steel helped build the modern world, shaping cities and industries that continue to thrive. But the lives of the workers who struggled in his mills, the strikes that ended in violence, the inequalities that his empire perpetuated, these too are part of his story. Was it all worth it? Perhaps in the end, Andrew Carnegie's greatest legacy is not just the buildings he left behind, but the questions his life forces us to ask. What does it mean to be successful? What is the true cost of ambition? And how do we measure the value of a life? For Andrew Carnegie, those questions may never have had clear answers, but they are the questions that define his legacy. A legacy that even today continues to inspire, to challenge, and to provoke reflection.